What happens when your family calls you a Harvard dropout at a graduation party? But then a black sedan pulls up and someone steps out asking for Dr. Ryan Matthews. This is the story of how my son let them laugh at his failures while he was secretly building his future. And when the truth finally walked into our backyard, it didn't just shock everyone. It changed everything they thought they knew about success. You know what's funny about family gatherings? Everyone pretends they're celebrating you, but really they're just waiting for their turn to remind you of your mistakes. And today? Today was supposed to be perfect. My name is Sarah Matthews, and I've been a registered nurse for 23 years. I've seen people at their absolute worst and their absolute best. I've held hands with dying patients and celebrated with new mothers. I thought I understood resilience, but nothing prepared me for watching my own son navigate the minefield that is family expectations. Today was Michael's day. My oldest son had just graduated Harvard Law summa cum laude with job offers from 3 of Boston's most prestigious firms. Our backyard looked like something Martha Stewart would feature in her magazine. I'd spent 3 days transforming our modest suburban space into what Doreen would later describe as surprisingly elegant for such a small budget. White string lights draped between the century-old oak trees that had been here when we bought the house 15 years ago. Tables covered in crisp ivory linens that I'd borrowed from the church. Centerpieces made from hydrangeas I'd grown myself arranged in mason jars because Pinterest convinced me it was charming rather than cheap. And enough champagne to drown a small village because nothing says, "We're proud of our Harvard graduate," like spending your entire savings account on Dom Perignon. Everyone was here. And when I say everyone, I mean the whole Matthews Rodriguez Johnson extended family circus. My sister Doreen flew in from Dallas with her investment banker husband Brad and their twin daughters, who speak 3 languages and play violin at a conservatory level. Uncle Pete drove down from Chicago with his new girlfriend Candy, who's 28 and works as a social media influencer, whatever that means. Great Aunt Millie made the trip from the assisted living facility with her walker and her sharp tongue intact, because God forbid she miss an opportunity to comment on everyone's life choices. Even my ex-mother-in-law Eleanor showed up despite the fact that her son, my ex-husband, had been absent from both boys' lives for the better part of a decade. But Eleanor never missed a graduation, a birthday, or an opportunity to remind everyone that the Matthews men have always been high achievers. As if genetics alone could take credit for my son's accomplishments. The weather was perfect. 78 degrees light breeze, the kind of late spring afternoon that makes you believe in possibility. Michael looked handsome in his navy suit, the one we'd bought for job interviews that turned out to be unnecessary because Harvard Law graduates don't interview, they get recruited. He was glowing with that particular confidence that comes from knowing you've exceeded every expectation anyone ever had for you. But you know what happens at every family party? Someone always has to bring up Ryan. My youngest son sat in the corner of the patio, nursing a glass of lemonade he'd been holding for over an hour, watching the celebration unfold around him like he was observing it through glass. He'd chosen a spot partly hidden behind the hydrangea bushes where he could see everything but remain peripheral to the action. Smart kid. He knew how these family gatherings worked. Ryan had always been different from Michael. Where Michael was gregarious and confident, Ryan was thoughtful and observant. Where Michael commanded attention effortlessly, Ryan preferred to listen from the margins. As children, Michael would perform elaborate shows for any adult willing to watch, while Ryan would disappear into his room with books and puzzles that were meant for kids twice his age. And while Michael navigated Harvard Law like he was born for it, Ryan had walked away from Harvard Computer Science like it was a prison sentence. The comments started small, the way they always do. Little observations passed around like appetizers. "Oh, Ryan," they'd say, tilting their heads with that practiced sympathy that feels more like pity. "Still figuring things out, huh?" Doreen's husband Brad, who sells life insurance and thinks that makes him qualified to give career advice, had cornered my neighbor Mrs. Peterson by the beverage table. "You know," he was saying loud enough for half the party to hear, "some kids just need more time to find their direction. Ryan's a smart boy, he'll land on his feet eventually." Eventually, as if success was inevitable for everyone, just a matter of waiting long enough. Uncle Pete, 3 beers deep and feeling philosophical, had found an audience near the dessert station. "The thing about young people today," he announced, "is they think they can just quit things when they get tough. In my day, you stuck it out. You didn't just walk away from opportunities like Harvard." In his day, Uncle Pete had worked at the same factory for 37 years and considered that the pinnacle of achievement. But somehow that qualified him to judge my son's decisions about cutting-edge technology and artificial intelligence. I watched Ryan from across the yard, and here's what broke my heart. He didn't argue. He didn't defend himself. He didn't tell them about the late nights in our garage surrounded by servers and code and dreams bigger than anything they could imagine. He didn't mention the emails from researchers who'd found his work on GitHub or the beta tests running in hospitals they'd never heard of. He just sat there folding his napkin into smaller and smaller squares, like he was trying to origami himself out of existence. Great Aunt Millie shuffled over with her walker because at 87 years old she'd earned the right to say whatever she wanted without consequences. "Well, at least you tried Harvard, sweetie," she announced, her voice carrying across the patio like a foghorn. That's more than most people can say. Not everyone's cut out for that kind of pressure. At least he tried, like Harvard was some impossible dream instead of a full scholarship he'd earned and walked away from on principle. The conversation was drawing attention now. People were setting down their drinks, pausing their own discussions to listen. Because there's nothing a family gathering loves more than a gentle public dissection of someone's perceived failures. "The important thing," added Eleanor, settling into a patio chair with the authority of someone who'd never made a questionable decision in her life, "is that you learn from your mistakes. Harvard's tough, darling. It takes a certain kind of person to handle that level of academic rigor. A certain kind of person." The implication hung in the air like humidity before a storm. Michael was that kind of person. Ryan wasn't. Michael, to his credit, looked increasingly uncomfortable with the direction of the conversation. He kept glancing over at Ryan with this expression that was part guilt, part confusion, like he wanted to intervene but didn't know how. "My older son isn't cruel. He's just never had to question whether he belonged somewhere. Everything's always been easy for him, from Little League to law school." But Ryan had spent the last 2 years learning that sometimes the hardest thing isn't succeeding where everyone expects you to. Sometimes the hardest thing is having the courage to succeed where no one thinks to look for you. "You know what I think," chimed in Doreen's 16-year-old daughter Madison, because apparently this pile-on needed a third-generation perspective. "I think it's actually really brave that Uncle Ryan is taking time to find himself. Like, not everyone can be super focused like Dad and know exactly what they want from day one." Find himself. As if Ryan was some lost soul wandering through life instead of someone who'd found exactly what he wanted to build and was building it one algorithm at a time. I felt my hands clench around my champagne flute. I wanted to scream. I wanted to stand up and defend my son, to tell them all exactly what he'd been accomplishing while they sat in their comfortable assumptions. I wanted to read them the emails from hospital administrators, the research citations, the recommendation letters from professors whose names they wouldn't recognize, but whose opinions actually mattered. But then something happened that changed everything. When Doreen cornered me by the dessert table, her voice dropping to that conspiratorial whisper that means she's about to say something she thinks is helpful, but is actually devastating, asking, "How's Ryan doing, really? I mean, is he seeing anyone getting therapy?" Sometimes when young people make such drastic decisions, I'd had enough. I set down my champagne flute, walked to the center of the patio, and cleared my throat. The conversations died down like someone had turned down the volume on the whole party. Michael looked confused. Ryan looked like he wanted to disappear into the hydrangeas. "I'd like to make a toast," I announced, my voice carrying across the yard with more authority than I'd felt in months. "To Ryan," I said, raising my glass high enough for everyone to see, "the brave one who quit Harvard." The silence that followed was so complete I could hear Mrs. Henderson's wind chimes 3 houses down. Then came the laughter, Not cruel exactly, but sharp enough to cut glass. Uncomfortable chuckles that said, "We're not sure if this is a joke, but we'll laugh just in case." Uncle Pete shook his head with a patronizing smile. "Sarah's always been supportive of her boys," he said to Brad like I wasn't standing right there. Doreen's twins giggled behind their hands. Even Michael cracked a smile, probably thinking I was being ironic, making light of a difficult situation. But I wasn't joking, and neither was Ryan when he made that decision 18 months ago. I looked at my youngest son still sitting quietly in his corner, and I saw something that made my chest tight with a mixture of pride and heartbreak. He wasn't embarrassed by my toast. He wasn't angry at the laughter. He was just waiting, like he knew something the rest of us didn't. And you know what he did? What they didn't know was the moment that would change everything was already on its way. In fact, if my timing was right, it was probably pulling into our driveway at that exact moment. But I'm getting ahead of myself. To understand why that moment mattered so much, to understand why Ryan could sit there so calmly, while his entire extended family treated him like a cautionary tale, you need to know what really happened when he left Harvard. You need to know why he walked away from their version of success to build his own. And trust me, it wasn't because he couldn't handle the pressure. It started with the phone calls. 3 a.m. calls from Cambridge, Massachusetts, where my son's voice sounded like it was coming from the bottom of a well distorted by exhaustion, and something deeper that I couldn't quite name at the time. "Mom, I can't sleep again." The first few times I chalked it up to college stress. Every parent knows that transition from high school to university can be rough even for the brightest kids, especially for the brightest kids sometimes. The pressure, the competition, the sudden realization that being the smartest person in your high school doesn't mean much when you're surrounded by the smartest people from every high school in the country. But these calls kept coming, week after week, month after month, always in the dead of night. When Ryan should have been sleeping, should have been dreaming about algorithms and artificial intelligence and all the brilliant things he was supposed to be learning. Instead, he was calling his mother, and his voice sounded hollow in a way that made my nurse instincts kick into overdrive. Ryan had always been different from Michael, and I don't just mean in personality. From the time he could hold a crayon, Ryan saw patterns where other people saw chaos. While other toddlers were stacking blocks, Ryan was arranging them in mathematical sequences. While his kindergarten classmates were learning to tie their shoes, Ryan was teaching himself basic programming on an old computer I'd bought at a garage sale. By middle school, he was building websites for local businesses. By high school, he'd developed an app that helped students with learning disabilities navigate their homework assignments. It wasn't anything fancy, just a simple organizational tool, but watching him explain how it worked to his special education teacher, seeing the pride in his eyes when she told him it was exactly what her students needed, that's when I knew my son wasn't just smart. He was purposeful. When Harvard offered him a full-ride scholarship to their computer science program, we thought we'd hit the lottery. The guidance counselor called it a once-in-a-lifetime opportunity. The local newspaper ran a story about local student earns Harvard scholarship. Even my ex-husband called to congratulate Ryan the first time he'd reached out in 2 years. But by Ryan's sophomore year, those late-night phone calls told a different story. "They want us to build another social media analytics tool," he told me one particularly rough night in February. His voice was hoarse, like he'd been arguing with someone for hours. Maybe he had been arguing with himself. "Mom, there are already 12 companies doing the exact same thing. We're copying homework at this point." I remember sitting in my kitchen at 2 in the morning, still in my scrubs from my shift at the hospital, trying to understand what my brilliant son was going through. I'd just spent 12 hours helping people recover from surgeries, monitoring vitals, administering medications that could save lives or end them depending on the dosage. Real work. Important work. work that mattered. And here was my son at one of the most prestigious universities in the world, feeling like his time was being wasted on projects that served no purpose beyond academic exercise. Tell me about your day, I said, because sometimes the best thing you can do for someone who's drowning is just listen. I spend 14 hours a day in libraries reading theories about machine learning from textbooks that were already outdated when they were published. Ryan continued, and I could hear him pacing in his dorm room, that restless energy he'd had since childhood when his mind was moving faster than his body could keep up. Then I sit in lectures where professors who haven't worked in industry for 20 years tell us how the real world works. And when I try to suggest something different, something that could actually help people, they tell me to stick to the curriculum. The curriculum. As if innovation could be standardized, packaged, and delivered in neat semester-sized portions. What kind of different things? I asked. Real things, Mom. Practical applications. I've been reading about rural hospitals, about how they struggle with resource allocation and staffing predictions. I think AI could help with that. Not just theoretical models, but actual working systems that could save lives. That was my Ryan, always thinking about how to help people, how to solve real problems. Even as a kid, when other children played video games for entertainment, Ryan played them to figure out how they worked, how they could be improved, how they could be used for education instead of just distraction. So, why don't you work on that? Because it's not in the syllabus. Because Professor Wellington says it's too ambitious for undergraduate work, and I should focus on mastering the fundamentals first. Because apparently learning to build another recommendation algorithm for a streaming service is more fundamental than learning to save lives. I could hear the frustration in his voice, but underneath that's something else. Something that sounded like his spirit breaking, piece by piece, assignment by assignment. The breaking point came during his junior year in March, during what should have been spring break. Instead of coming home or going somewhere warm with friends, Ryan had stayed on campus to work on what he called a side project, something he'd been developing in his spare time in the margins of his official coursework. He called me at 11 p.m. on a Tuesday, and this time he wasn't just frustrated. He was crying. My son doesn't cry. Ryan hadn't cried since he was 8 years old and fell off his bike, scraping his knee so badly it needed stitches. Even then, he'd only cried for about 30 seconds before asking the emergency room doctor to explain how sutures worked. But there he was, sobbing into the phone from his dorm room in Cambridge, telling me about something that had happened in his advanced algorithm design class. I presented my healthcare prediction system, he said, between hiccups that reminded me he was still just a kid despite his brilliance. 3 months of work, Mom. 3 months of research coding testing. I'd been corresponding with administrators at rural hospitals in Montana, Wyoming, places where they're making life and death decisions based on gut feelings because they don't have data. What happened? Professor Wellington shut me down in front of the entire class, said it was an interesting hobby project, but not appropriate for academic evaluation. Said if I wanted to play around with real-world applications, I should wait until graduate school. Then he assigned me to work on the class project instead. Which is building a dating app algorithm, Mom. A fucking dating app algorithm. Ryan never swore. In 20 years of raising him, I could count on one hand the number of times I'd heard him use profanity. But there it was, raw and sharp and full of everything he couldn't say in that classroom. I spent 3 months building something that could help hospitals save lives, and they want me to help people find dates. That's when I understood. This wasn't about academic pressure or social adjustment or any of the normal college struggles. This was about a fundamental mismatch between who my son was and what the system wanted him to become. Ryan, I said, choosing my words carefully because I could feel how fragile he was in that moment. What do you want to do? I want to come home, he whispered. I want to work on real things. I want to build something that matters, not just something that looks good on a transcript. Then come home. But Mom, it's Harvard. People don't just walk away from Harvard. People walk away from things that aren't serving them every day, honey. The question is whether you're walking away from something or towards something. What do you mean? Are you running from the challenge or are you running toward your purpose? There was a long pause. I could hear him thinking, weighing, considering. Finally, he said, I know exactly what I want to build, Mom. I can see it so clearly, but I can't build it here. They won't let me. Then build it somewhere else. The family didn't understand. When Ryan walked into our house that December with 2 duffel bags, a laptop, and a cardboard box full of textbooks he'd never open again. The phone started ringing before he'd even made it to his room. Doreen called first, of course. She'd heard through the family grapevine, probably from Eleanor, who had somehow found out before I'd even told anyone. He's throwing his life away, she hissed through the receiver like Ryan could hear her from upstairs. Do you know what people are going to think? What are you going to tell them at church, at work? How do you explain that your son dropped out of Harvard? I'll tell them he made a brave decision to follow his passion instead of other people's expectations. I said, passion doesn't pay the bills, Sarah. Passion doesn't get you into graduate school or land you a job at Google. But Doreen had always measured success in terms that fit neatly on Christmas card letters. Brad got promoted to senior vice president. The girls made honor roll again. We bought a bigger house in a better neighborhood. She couldn't understand that sometimes the most successful thing you can do is walk away from success that doesn't serve you. Uncle Pete was more direct when he called. The kid's lost his mind. Harvard doesn't just let you back in when you change your mind, you know. This isn't community college. He's burned a bridge he'll never be able to rebuild. Even Michael called from his law school study group voice, tight with something between embarrassment and concern. Mom, people are asking me why my brother dropped out. What am I supposed to tell them? Tell them he's building something important. But what is he building? He won't talk to me about it. He just locks himself in his room with his computer. It was true. Ryan had claimed his childhood bedroom and transformed it into something that looked like mission control at NASA. Multiple monitors, cables running along the baseboards, whiteboards covered in equations that looked like beautiful, incomprehensible art. He'd emerge for meals sometimes and to shower when I reminded him. But mostly he worked, 18 hours a day, 7 days a week with the kind of focused intensity I'd only seen in medical residents during their first year. What are you working on, honey? I asked him one evening, finding him surrounded by legal pads covered in diagrams and flowcharts. He looked up at me with eyes that hadn't sparkled like that in months. The hollow, exhausted expression from his Harvard days was gone, replaced by something I recognized from his childhood. Pure, undiluted excitement about discovery. Something that's actually going to help people, Mom. Something real. That's when I saw it. The notebook on his desk, thick and worn like he'd been filling it for weeks. On the cover, written in his careful, precise handwriting, Project Hawk. What's Hawk? Ryan smiled, and for the first time in over a year, he looked like my son again. Not the stressed, defeated version who'd been calling me from Cambridge, but the kid who used to disappear into projects for hours and emerge with something amazing. Healthcare algorithm for workforce and kit distribution. He said, his voice gaining energy with each word. It's going to revolutionize how rural hospitals manage resources. Predictive modeling for patient influx, optimized staffing schedules, supply chain management that adapts to real-time needs instead of historical averages. He started drawing diagrams on a whiteboard, explaining algorithms and data models and integration protocols. I understood maybe 10% of the technical details, but I understood 100% of the passion behind them. It works by analyzing patterns in patient admission data, cross-referencing with seasonal trends, local demographics, even weather patterns that might affect emergency room visits. He continued, his hands moving as fast as his words. Then, it predicts staffing needs up to 2 weeks in advance and automatically adjusts supply orders to prevent both shortages and waste. How do you know this will work? Because I've been testing it. Dr. Patricia Martinez at Rural General in Montana has been running a beta version for 6 weeks. They've reduced supply waste by 37% and improved staffing efficiency by 23%. Dr. Martinez. My son was corresponding with actual doctors. Actual hospital administrators, people whose opinions carried weight in the real world instead of just in academic journals. She wants to expand the trial to 3 more hospitals in her network, Ryan continued, and I've got interest from facilities in Wyoming, North Dakota, even Alaska. That's when I realized what Ryan had done. While his professors at Harvard were teaching him to think inside established frameworks, he'd stepped outside those frameworks entirely. While they were focused on academic exercises, he was solving real problems for real people. Ryan, this is incredible. Why didn't you tell us? Because I needed to prove it worked first. Because I needed to know I wasn't just some dropout with delusions of grandeur. Some dropout. My son had walked away from the most prestigious computer science program in the country to build something that could revolutionize healthcare, and he was worried about being called a dropout. But I understood. When everyone around you is measuring success by where you go to school, instead of what you accomplish, it becomes easy to doubt your own judgment. How long have you been working on this? Since freshman year at Harvard, it started as that side project Professor Wellington called a hobby, but I kept developing it, kept refining it, kept reaching out to hospitals that might be willing to test it. 9 months. My son had been building his future for 9 months while his family worried about his present. He didn't know it then, but that notebook was going to change everything. Not just for him, but for hospitals across the country, and eventually for every single person sitting in our backyard right now, judging him for walking away from their version of success. But first, he had to prove that innovation doesn't require permission from institutions. That sometimes the most important work happens in garages and bedrooms and anywhere else someone with a vision is willing to put in the hours to make it real. With $3,000 of his own savings equipment, he'd bought piece by piece and more determination than any 20-year-old should have to carry. Alone, Ryan was about to show the world what passion looks like when it's backed by purpose. Our garage became Ryan's laboratory, and when I say laboratory, I mean it looked like a tornado had hit Best Buy, decided to collaborate with NASA, and then invited a coffee shop to join the party. He'd transformed our 2-car garage into something that hummed with electronic life 24 hours a day. Server racks lined one wall, their blue LED lights blinking like electronic heartbeats. He'd strung heavy-duty extension cords from every outlet in the house, creating a web of power cables that snaked across the concrete floor between stacks of computer equipment I couldn't even name. The electricity bill went from a reasonable $120 a month to something that looked like a mortgage payment. When I called the utility company to make sure there wasn't an error, the customer service representative asked if we'd started running a small business out of our home. Something like that, I told her. There were whiteboards covering every available wall space filled with equations that hurt my brain to look at, and flowcharts that resembled subway maps for cities that didn't exist yet. Cables of every conceivable color and thickness connected machines that beeped, whirred, and occasionally made sounds that reminded me of R2-D2 having a conversation with a dial-up modem. And coffee cups. Dear God, the coffee cups. I'd find them everywhere, on top of servers balanced precariously on keyboard trays clustered around his makeshift desk like ceramic monuments to sleep deprivation. Some contained coffee so old it had developed ecosystems. Others held liquid that might have started as coffee but had evolved into something that could probably power spacecraft. Ryan would disappear into that garage for 12, 14, sometimes 18 hours at a time. I'd bring him sandwiches that he'd accept gratefully and then forget to eat until they'd transformed into science experiments. I'd find turkey and Swiss melts growing curious mold formations, or grilled cheese sandwiches that had achieved the structural integrity of ceramic tile. You need to eat actual food, honey, I'd tell him, clearing away plates that looked like they belonged in a microbiology textbook. 5 more minutes, Mom, he'd mumble, his fingers never stopping their dance across multiple keyboards. I'm almost there. Almost where I didn't know, but I could see it in his eyes. He was chasing something. Something big. something that kept him working through thunderstorms, that knocked out power to half the neighborhood, something that made him forget to sleep for 36 hours straight, something that burned in him with the kind of intensity I'd only seen in the emergency room when doctors were fighting to save lives. The rejection emails started coming in around month 3, and they arrived with the reliability of bad weather. 26 venture capital firms, 43 technology companies, 14 university research departments, 8 government agencies, all with variations of the same polite dismissal. Thank you for your submission, but we don't see the market potential for healthcare-focused AI at this time. This project falls outside our current investment focus areas. While your technical approach shows promise, we're prioritizing consumer-facing applications with broader commercial appeal. Healthcare algorithms represent a saturated market with limited scalability. Each rejection hit like a small blow, and I watched my son absorb them with the kind of quiet dignity that made me both proud and heartbroken. He'd read each email carefully, sometimes twice, then file it away in a folder on his desktop labeled Learning Experiences. One particularly brutal rejection came from a Silicon Valley firm whose name I recognized from TechCrunch articles. Their response was so dismissive it made my hands shake with anger. Healthcare algorithms are oversaturated. Focus on consumer applications with broader appeal. Perhaps consider pivoting to social media optimization or e-commerce solutions. I found Ryan staring at that email for 2 hours straight, just sitting there, not moving, like he was trying to decode some hidden message in their words. His coffee had gone cold, his sandwich untouched, his multiple monitors displaying code that seemed to mock him with its complexity. Maybe they're right, he said quietly, his voice barely audible over the hum of the servers. Maybe I'm just some college dropout with delusions of grandeur. Maybe I'm wasting my time building something nobody wants. That's when I wanted to drive to California and have some very direct words with those people. But Ryan didn't need my anger. He needed my faith. You know what I think? I said, pulling up a folding chair next to his desk, pushing aside cables and notebooks to make space. I think you're not wrong. You're just early. He smiled at that, but it didn't reach his eyes. The doubt had settled in that insidious voice that whispers, maybe everyone else knows something you don't. 3 more months passed. More rejections. More late nights. More coffee cups achieving sentience. I started to worry that maybe Ryan was fighting a battle he couldn't win. Not because his ideas weren't good, but because the world wasn't ready for them. Then, on a Tuesday morning in June, everything changed. Ryan came running into the kitchen at 8:30 a.m., laptop clutched against his chest, eyes wider than I'd seen them since Christmas morning when he was 7 years old and discovered that Santa had brought him a computer programming book along with the video games he'd requested. Mom, you're not going to believe this. He was practically vibrating with excitement, his hair sticking up in directions that suggested he'd been running his hands through it for hours. His t-shirt was wrinkled, and he had that slightly manic energy that comes from too much caffeine and not enough sleep. But his eyes were bright with something I hadn't seen in months. Hope. He set his laptop on the kitchen table, pushing aside my morning coffee and the stack of bills I'd been pretending to organize. The screen displayed his email inbox, and there, among the usual spam and medical conference newsletters I subscribed to, was a message that made my heart skip. Subject line, "You're not wrong, you're early." I stared at those words, the exact words I'd said to him months ago, and felt something electric run down my spine. Either this was an incredible coincidence, or someone had been paying very close attention to my son's work. The sender was C.R. Hawthorne. The email was short, professional, but there was something warm about the tone that made me trust it immediately, the way you can sometimes sense a person's character through their word choices. Dear Ryan, it read, I discovered your open-source healthcare algorithm repository on GitHub while researching predictive modeling applications for resource allocation in underserved medical facilities. Your approach to integrating demographic prediction with supply chain optimization is remarkably sophisticated. particularly your use of Bayesian networks, to account for uncertainty in rural healthcare settings. I'm a retired MIT professor, specializing in applied artificial intelligence, with a focus on real-world implementation, and I'd very much like to discuss your work. Would you be available for a call this week? Best regards, Charles R. Hawthorne, PhD, Professor Emeritus, MIT Department of Electrical Engineering and Computer Science. Ryan was pacing around our kitchen like a caged tiger, his excitement so infectious I could feel my own pulse quickening. "Mom, do you know who Charles Hawthorne is?" he said, his words tumbling over each other in his rush to explain. He literally wrote the textbook on machine learning algorithms that half the computer science programs in the country use. He's published over 200 papers in Nature Science, IEE Transactions, all the journals that matter. He consulted for Google when they were developing their early search algorithms, advised Microsoft on their AI ethics board, worked with the Department of Defense on predictive analytics for military logistics. I didn't know who Charles Hawthorne was, but I could see what his email meant to Ryan. After months of rejections from people who seemed to dismiss his work without truly understanding it, here was someone whose opinion carried real weight, someone who'd taken the time to examine Ryan's code and see its potential. And he wants to talk to me, Mom, not about some theoretical academic exercise, but about actual implementation. Real-world application. The call was scheduled for that Friday at 2 p.m. Ryan spent the intervening days preparing like he was defending a doctoral thesis. He printed out research papers, organized his code repositories, created presentations, explaining his algorithms and their practical applications. By Thursday night, our dining room table looked like mission control for a space launch. I wasn't supposed to listen to the call, but the garage walls are thin, and I may have found several urgent tasks that required me to organize the storage closet right next to where Ryan was talking. Purely coincidental, of course. "Ryan," came a voice through the laptop speakers at exactly 2 p.m., warm and slightly gravelly, like someone who'd spent decades teaching students who thought they knew everything but usually didn't. I've been in this field for 35 years, and I can count on one hand the number of truly innovative approaches I've seen from researchers your age. What you've built isn't just impressive from a technical standpoint, it's necessary from a humanitarian one. I heard Ryan's chair creak as he leaned forward, and I could picture him doing that thing he'd done since childhood when he was focused, tilting his head slightly to the left and pressing his lips together in concentration. "Professor Hawthorne, I have to ask, how did you even find my code? I mean, it's just sitting on GitHub with like 12 stars and 3 forks. It's not exactly trending." Hawthorne chuckled, and there was something paternal about the sound that made me like him immediately. "Son, when you've been hunting for breakthrough algorithms as long as I have, you develop a sense for what matters. Your code doesn't just work elegantly, though it does that. It solves problems that established researchers are afraid to tackle, because they're too invested in conventional approaches and incremental improvements. But the rejections I've been getting suggest that nobody thinks healthcare AI is worth pursuing. The rejections you've been getting are from people who see something in your models that academia isn't ready for," Hawthorne interrupted, and I could hear the authority in his voice, the confidence of someone who'd seen enough innovation cycles to recognize the pattern. "The healthcare industry is notoriously resistant to change, especially when that change comes from someone without traditional credentials or institutional backing. But you know what? Some of the most important innovations in history came from people who were told they were wrong, too early, too ambitious." There was a pause, and I could hear papers rustling through the laptop speakers. "I've reviewed your beta test results from Rural General in Montana," Hawthorne continued. 37% reduction in supply waste, 23% improvement in staffing efficiency, and most importantly, a 41% decrease in patient wait times during high-volume periods. Those aren't theoretical numbers, Ryan. Those are lives improved, stress, reduced resources, maximized. Dr. Martinez has been incredible to work with, Ryan said, and I could hear the gratitude in his voice. She took a chance on something completely unproven. She took a chance on something that works. There's a difference. But here's what concerns me. You're operating in isolation. You're brilliant, but brilliance without mentorship, without institutional support, without a network of peers and collaborators can only take you so far. Are you saying I should go back to school? God, no. Hawthorne laughed, and it was such a genuine, surprised laugh that I found myself smiling in the storage closet. The last thing you need is to get bogged down in institutional thinking. What I'm proposing is something different. Something better. Another pause. I held my breath. I'd like to propose weekly mentoring sessions, virtual meetings where we can discuss your algorithms, refine your approaches, and most importantly, prepare you for the resistance you're going to face. Because make no mistake, Ryan, what you're building is going to disrupt established systems, and disruption always creates pushback. You'd do that. For me. Ryan, I spent my career teaching students who were smart enough to follow instructions perfectly. You're the first person I've met in years who's smart enough to ignore instructions when they're wrong. That's not just intelligence, that's wisdom. And wisdom deserves guidance, not discouragement. That's how it started. Every Thursday at 4 p.m., like clockwork, Ryan would disappear into the garage for what he called his Hawthorne sessions. 2 hours of deep conversation about machine learning theory, healthcare systems, analysis, implementation strategies, and something that surprised me, the psychology of institutional change. Innovation isn't just about building something better, I heard Hawthorne explain during one session. It's about understanding why people resist better things and helping them see the value despite their resistance. These weren't typical professor-student relationships. Hawthorne treated Ryan like a colleague, a peer researcher whose insights were worth serious consideration. He'd ask Ryan's opinion on papers he was reviewing, invite him to comment on research proposals from other institutions, even mention him in conversations with other MIT faculty. There's a young researcher I've been mentoring. I heard him tell someone during a conference call that Ryan had put on speaker. His work on predictive healthcare resource allocation is the most promising application I've seen in a decade. Meanwhile, the family continued their little comments and observations, completely oblivious to the transformation happening in our garage. At our 4th of July barbecue, Doreen cornered me by the potato salad, her voice pitched low in that conspiratorial tone she used when she wanted to discuss family concerns. "So how's Ryan's little computer hobby going?" she asked, glancing toward the house where Ryan was presumably working, instead of socializing with relatives he saw twice a year. "It's going well," I said, spooning coleslaw onto my plate and trying to keep my voice neutral. Has he thought about maybe taking some community college classes just to get back into the habit of structured learning? Sometimes when young people drop out, they lose their academic momentum. As if learning could only happen in classrooms, as if innovation required institutional permission. At Michael's birthday dinner in August, Uncle Pete wondered aloud, his voice carrying that particular blend of concern and condescension that older relatives specialize in. When's the boy going to get a real job? I mean, playing around with computers is fine as a hobby, but eventually he needs to think about his future. A real job, like building software that could revolutionize healthcare delivery, was somehow less real than selling insurance or managing investment portfolios. Even Michael, when he was home for a weekend in September, mentioned that his law school friends kept asking about the brother who dropped out. Not with malice, but with that curious concern that young professionals have for people who don't follow traditional paths. They just don't understand why someone would walk away from Harvard, Michael explained, and I could see he was trying to bridge two worlds that didn't quite make sense to each other. They all thought Ryan was still figuring life out, fumbling around, playing with computers in the garage like some overgrown teenager who couldn't commit to adult responsibilities. But here's what they didn't see. Every Thursday, after his sessions with Professor Hawthorne, Ryan would emerge from that garage looking more confident, more focused, more like the person he was always meant to become. The technical discussions were important, but the mentorship went deeper than algorithms and code. Hawthorne was teaching Ryan how to navigate professional relationships, how to present complex ideas to non-technical audiences, how to build credibility in a field dominated by people with traditional credentials. "Your work speaks for itself," Hawthorne told him during one session I overheard. But you need to learn how to help people hear what it's saying. By October, Ryan wasn't just working with Dr. Martinez in Montana anymore. His Hawk system was being tested in rural hospitals across 3 states with waiting lists of facilities that wanted to participate in the pilot program. He was consulting with healthcare administrators, presenting to medical boards, collaborating with IT departments to integrate his algorithms into existing hospital management systems. He'd built a network of professionals who respected his work, who sought his input, who treated him as an expert in his field. While his family saw a college dropout, the healthcare industry was beginning to see Dr. Ryan Matthews, not because he had a doctorate, but because his expertise commanded that level of respect. But the most important change wasn't professional. It was personal. Ryan had found his purpose, and purpose has a way of transforming everything about a person. He walked differently, spoke with more confidence, carried himself like someone who knew exactly where he was going and why. He wasn't figuring life out. He was building it. Line by line, algorithm by algorithm, breakthrough by breakthrough. And in just a few months, when MIT would announce their new Applied AI Division partnership, when Ryan's Hawk system would be running in rural hospitals across 8 states, when the boy they called a dropout would be invited to speak at medical conferences and AI symposiums, they'd all pretend they believed in him from the beginning. But I knew the truth. Ryan had been ready all along. He just needed someone to see what he was building instead of focusing on what he'd walked away from. The garage laboratory that my family dismissed as an expensive hobby was actually an incubator for innovation that would change how thousands of people received medical care. And the young man they thought was lost was actually exactly where he needed to be, doing exactly what he was meant to do, building exactly what the world needed. He just hadn't told them yet. So there we were back at Michael's graduation party, and you could practically feel the tension crackling through the summer air like humidity before a thunderstorm. Michael was holding court by the dessert table, his Harvard Law diploma practically glowing in the late afternoon sun. Everyone wanted their picture with the graduate, their moment to bask in reflected glory. Uncle Pete was telling anyone who'd listen about how he always knew that boy would make something of himself. Doreen was live streaming the whole thing on Instagram with captions like, "So proud of my brilliant nephew," and "Harvard Law, baby." Meanwhile, Ryan sat at the far end of the patio, quietly nursing the same glass of lemonade he'd been holding for an hour. He'd found a spot partly hidden behind the hydrangea bushes where he could observe without being the center of attention. Smart kid. He knew how these family gatherings worked. But family gatherings have a way of finding you no matter where you hide. It started with great Aunt Millie, bless her heart. She shuffled over with her walker plopped down next to Ryan and announced loud enough for half the party to hear, "Well, at least you tried Harvard, sweetie. That's more than most people can say." At least he tried Harvard, like it was some participation trophy instead of a full scholarship he'd walked away from on principle. Ryan just nodded politely and said, "Yes, ma'am, I did." That opened the floodgates. Suddenly, everyone had something helpful to share about Ryan's journey. Doreen's husband, Brad, who sells insurance and thinks that makes him an expert on life planning, wandered over with his beer and his unsolicited wisdom. "You know, Ryan, there's no shame in taking your time to figure things out. Some people just need to explore their options before they settle down into something stable." Explore his options. Like Ryan was some confused teenager instead of someone who'd been mentored by an MIT professor for the past year and a half. Then came Doreen herself, arms full of plates she was collecting, but really just looking for an excuse to join the conversation. "Everyone's on their own path," she said, her voice dripping with that particular brand of sympathy that feels more like pity. "Some paths are just longer than others. Longer." As if success was a race, and Ryan was limping behind trying to catch up to the real winners. I watched my youngest son from across the yard, and here's what broke my heart. He didn't argue. He didn't defend himself. He didn't tell them about the hospitals already testing his algorithms, or the research papers that cited his work, or the weekly calls with one of the most respected minds in artificial intelligence. He just sat there folding his napkin into smaller and smaller squares, like he was trying to make himself disappear along with it. The important thing, added Uncle Pete, settling into a patio chair like he was about to deliver the wisdom of the ages, is that you learn from your mistakes. Harvard's tough son. Not everyone can handle that pressure. Takes a certain kind of person to make it through. A certain kind of person. The implication was clear. Ryan wasn't that kind of person. Michael was, but Ryan, well, Ryan was the cautionary tale. Michael, to his credit, looked uncomfortable with the whole conversation. He kept glancing over at Ryan with this expression that was part guilt, part confusion, like he wanted to say something but didn't know what. My older son isn't a bad kid. He's just never had to question whether he belonged somewhere. Everything's always come easy for him. But Ryan had spent the last 2 years learning that sometimes the hardest thing isn't succeeding where everyone expects you to. Sometimes the hardest thing is having the courage to succeed where no one thinks to look for you. You know what I think, said Doreen's teenage daughter, because apparently the pile-on needed a third generation. I think it's actually brave that Uncle Ryan is taking time to find himself. Not everyone can be like Dad and know exactly what they want to do from day one. Find himself, as if Ryan was lost instead of exactly where he needed to be. I wanted to scream. I wanted to stand up and tell them all exactly what Ryan had been building in our garage. I wanted to show them the emails from hospital administrators thanking him for beta testing his system. I wanted to read them the letter from Professor Hawthorne recommending Ryan for MIT's Applied AI division. I wanted to shield him, say something, do something. But then I caught Ryan's eye across the yard, and he gave me the smallest shake of his head. Just enough to say, "Not yet, Mom. This isn't the moment." And I realized something that made me both proud and heartbroken at the same time. This moment wasn't mine to steal. Ryan had been preparing for this conversation his whole life, and he knew something the rest of us didn't. He knew it was almost over, because while my family sat there dispensing their well-meaning condescension, a black sedan was pulling into our driveway, and the man getting out of that car was about to change everything these people thought they knew about failure success, and my brilliant son who dared to build his own path. You know how in movies there's always that moment when everything goes quiet, right before something big happens. The music stops, conversations fade, and you can practically hear the universe holding its breath. That's exactly what happened when the black sedan pulled up to our front gate. It wasn't just any car. This was one of those sleek luxury vehicles that whispers, "Important person," without having to shout about it. The kind of car that makes neighbors peek through their curtains and wonder who's visiting and why they don't drive something that nice. The engine cut off, and suddenly our backyard party felt different. Uncle Pete stopped mid-sentence in whatever story he was telling about his golf game. Doreen paused with her phone halfway to her face, her Instagram story forgotten. Even the kids stopped running around and just stared. The driver's door opened, and out stepped a man who looked like he'd been sent from Central Casting to play distinguished professor. Tall, probably in his mid-60s, with silver hair perfectly styled and a charcoal gray suit that probably cost more than most people's rent. But it wasn't his clothes that commanded attention. It was the way he carried himself. Confident without being arrogant. Purposeful without being rushed. He surveyed our backyard like he was taking inventory, his eyes moving methodically from face to face until they landed exactly where they were meant to land. On Ryan, the man walked through our gate like he owned the place, but not in a rude way. More like someone who was used to walking into rooms where important decisions were made. His stride was measured, deliberate, and every step seemed to make our little family gathering shrink in comparison. People started setting down their drinks, cameras lowered. Conversations didn't just pause, they died mid-word. He walked straight to Ryan, who was still sitting in his chair by the hydrangeas, still holding that napkin he'd been folding and refolding, and said the words that would change everything. "Dr. Ryan Matthews." Doctor. The silence that followed was so complete, I could hear Mrs. Henderson's wind chimes 3 houses down. Ryan looked up, and for the first time all day, I saw him smile. really smile. Not the polite, tolerant expression he'd been wearing while his family talked about his journey and his longer path. This was the smile of someone who'd been waiting for this exact moment. Professor Hawthorne, Ryan said, standing up and extending his hand. They shook hands like colleagues, like equals, like two people who shared something the rest of us couldn't even begin to understand. Hawthorne's voice carried across our suddenly silent backyard with the kind of authority that comes from decades of commanding lecture halls full of MIT's brightest minds. "We're ready to announce your collaboration with MIT's Applied AI division," he said as casually as if he were discussing the weather. "If you're ready, let's go." The collective gasp from my family was audible. MIT, Applied AI division, collaboration. Doreen's mouth fell open so wide I thought she might swallow a bug. Uncle Pete's beer can stopped halfway to his lips and just stayed there, suspended in disbelief. Great Aunt Millie gripped her walker so tight her knuckles went white. Michael looked like someone had just told him Santa Claus was real and lived in our garage. But here's what got me. Here's what made my heart swell so big I thought it might burst right out of my chest. Ryan didn't gloat. He didn't turn to face his family with some triumphant, "I told you so" expression. He didn't deliver a speech about believing in yourself or prove all the doubters wrong. He just stood up, straightened his shirt, and said, "I'm ready." No explanations, no justifications. No need to rehash the last 2 years of condescending comments and well-meaning put-downs. Just presence. Hawthorne nodded approvingly, like this was exactly the response he'd expected. "The car is ready. We have a conference call with the division heads in an hour, and then we'll need to review the final algorithms before tomorrow's announcement." Tomorrow's announcement. Whatever Ryan had been building in our garage for the past year and a half was about to become public knowledge. As they walked toward the gate, I caught fragments of their conversation. "The beta results from Rural General were exceptional," Hawthorne was saying. 37% improvement in resource allocation efficiency, and that's with limited implementation. "The scalability test should be ready by Thursday," Ryan replied, his voice steady and professional. "Dr. Chen's team finished the validation protocols yesterday." Dr. Chen's team. My son was discussing validation protocols with MIT professors and referencing team members I'd never heard of because he'd been living in a professional world none of us knew existed. They reached the car, and Hawthorne opened the passenger door for Ryan. Just before getting in, my son turned back and caught my eye across the yard. He didn't wave. He didn't say goodbye. He just mouthed 2 words, "Thank you." Then he got into that black sedan, and they drove away, leaving behind a backyard full of people who thought they knew exactly who Ryan Matthews was and what he was capable of. The silence stretched for about 30 seconds after the car disappeared. Then everyone started talking at once. "Did he say MIT? What's an applied AI division? How long has this been going on? Dr. Ryan Matthews. Since when is he a doctor?" But I barely heard them. I was too busy thinking about something Professor Hawthorne had said during one of those Thursday afternoon sessions. Something I'd overheard while pretending to organize the storage closet. "Ryan," he'd said, "the world is full of people who mistake credentials for intelligence and recognition for worth. The truly brilliant ones learn early that validation from the right source is worth more than applause from a crowd. No speech, no drama, just truth walking into a backyard full of doubters and changing everything they thought they knew." And the beautiful part, Ryan had known this moment was coming. He'd been preparing for it, working toward it, building toward it for 18 months. While his family saw a dropout, MIT saw a doctor. While we saw failure, they saw the future. And my son, my brilliant patient, quietly determined son, had known all along that the only opinion that mattered was his own. Have you ever watched a group of people try to pretend they weren't just completely wrong about something? It's like watching someone try to unring a bell. After Ryan left with Professor Hawthorne, our backyard party resumed, but the energy was all wrong. People kept glancing at the gate where the black sedan had been, like they expected it to reappear and explain what had just happened. Conversations restarted in hushed tones, punctuated by long, awkward pauses. Doreen was the first to try to regain control of the narrative. She always was good at that spinning situations to maintain her position as the family authority on everything. She clapped her hands together like she was calling a PTA meeting to order. Well, she announced to no one in particular, her voice pitched slightly too high. I guess Ryan's giving TED Talks now or something. That's wonderful. So modern. TED Talks or something. Like she had any idea what MIT's Applied AI division actually did, or what it meant that they'd personally recruited my son. I looked at her, this woman who'd spent the last 2 years making little comments about Ryan's phase and his computer hobby, and I felt something settle deep in my chest. Not anger, not vindication, just clarity. He didn't need to tell you, I said quietly. He didn't owe you that. Doreen blinked at me like I'd spoken in a foreign language. Well, of course, but family should support each other, share their successes. Family should support each other before they're successful, I replied, not after it becomes inconvenient not to. The rest of the party continued around us, but something had shifted permanently. You could see it in the way people looked at each other, like they were all suddenly questioning what else they might have gotten wrong. Uncle Pete kept shaking his head and muttering, MIT, huh? Well, I'll be damned. Like Ryan's success was some kind of cosmic surprise instead of the result of 2 years of 18-hour days and unwavering determination. Michael pulled me aside by the dessert table, his face a mixture of confusion and something that might have been guilt. Mom, did you know about MIT? I knew he was working on something important, I said. I didn't know exactly what, but I knew it mattered to him. That was enough. But why didn't he tell us? Why didn't he say anything? I looked at my older son, this brilliant young man who'd never had to question whether he belonged somewhere, and I realized he genuinely didn't understand. Michael, honey, when was the last time anyone in this family asked Ryan about his work without making it sound like they were humoring a child? He opened his mouth to answer, then closed it again, because he couldn't think of a single time. None of us could. That's when I realized something that changed everything I thought I knew about protecting the people you love. Ryan had never needed defending. He'd needed space to arrive on his own terms. While we'd been worried about his feelings, he'd been building his future. While we'd been managing family expectations, he'd been exceeding professional ones. While we'd been trying to shield him from judgment, he'd been earning respect from people who actually mattered in his field. The party wound down over the next hour, but the whispers continued. I heard fragments of conversations as people gathered their purses and said their goodbyes. I always thought there was something special about that boy. Remember how smart he was with computers even as a kid. Harvard's loss, clearly. Suddenly, everyone had always believed in Ryan. Everyone had always seen his potential. Everyone had just been waiting for the right moment to say so. Funny how that works. After the last guest left and Michael went back to his apartment to update his LinkedIn profile with "Brother works at MIT," or whatever it is law students do when they need to process unexpected information, I found myself alone in Ryan's old room. His desk was exactly as he'd left it before getting in that car. 2 monitors, still glowing lines of code flowing across the screens like digital poetry. Notebooks stacked with that careful precision he'd inherited from his father. And there, stuck to the edge of his main monitor, a small yellow post-it note in Ryan's handwriting: launch prototype 7 days. 7 days. My son was 7 days away from launching something that would change how rural hospitals manage their resources, and he'd spent the afternoon listening to his family treat him like a lost cause. My phone rang around 9 that evening. Ryan's name on the caller ID. Hi, honey. How did your meeting go? Better than expected, he said, and I could hear the smile in his voice. The partnership is official. We're announcing it Monday morning. MIT's giving me a full research position, and 3 hospital systems want to implement Hawk by the end of the year. I'm so proud of you. Mom, he said, and his voice got quieter, more serious. Thanks for staying quiet when the noise got loud. I knew exactly what he meant. All those family dinners when I'd wanted to defend him. All those parties where I'd wanted to list his accomplishments. All those moments when I'd bitten my tongue instead of biting their heads off. You never needed me to fight your battles, I said. No, but I needed you to trust that I could fight them myself. That meant everything. After we hung up, I sat in his room for a long time, looking at that post-it note and thinking about the difference between protecting someone and believing in them. Ryan had spent 2 years proving that the world was wrong about him. Not because he needed the world's approval, but because he had work to do that mattered more than anyone's opinion of his choices. And you know what? That's exactly the kind of person I raised him to be. Let them whisper, let them doubt, let them revise their memories and pretend they always knew he'd succeed. Because when truth finally walks in, when real achievement shows up in a black sedan and calls you doctor, when the future arrives to collect what you've been building in secret, it doesn't need permission from anyone. It just needs a name. And my son's name is Ryan Matthews. Dr. Ryan Matthews. And I couldn't be prouder. Have you ever had to prove your worth to people who doubted you? What would you have done in Ryan's situation? Let me know in the comments below. And if you enjoyed this story about quiet determination and unexpected success, hit that subscribe button for more real stories about people who chose their own path and made it work. Trust me, you won't want to miss what's coming next.